and CFBI? You expect me to believe that?
That is a legitimate credential, officer. I suggest you run it.
The heat was a physical presence. It pressed down on the asphalt of the federal building's parking lot, squeezing shimmering waves of distortion into the air. At just past 1 in the afternoon, the sun was a merciless white disk in a bleached-out sky, and the silence was as oppressive as the humidity. Most sensible people were inside, protected by the hum of industrial-grade air conditioning. But Officer Dean Miller was not inside. He was in his cruiser, the engine running for the sole purpose of churning out cool air that barely kept the sweat from beading on his brow. He was 36, with a face that was beginning to show the strain of a decade on the force, the slight paunch over his duty belt, the permanent lines of cynicism etched around his eyes. He saw his beat not as a community to protect, but as a territory to control, a series of potential threats that needed to be identified and neutralized before they could fester. His patrol route today was a punishment, he was sure of it. Looping around the sterile office parks and government buildings felt like being put out to pasture. There was no action here, no real police work. Just the endless, monotonous circuit of concrete and glass, a world of bureaucrats and paper pushers he neither understood nor respected. His resentment simmered just beneath the surface, a low-grade fever that colored every observation. He had been passed over for promotion to detective again last month. The official reason was a lack of community engagement metrics. He knew the real reason. It was politics. It was always politics. They wanted officers who smiled and shook hands, who saw shades of gray. Miller saw only black and white, threat and non-threat. His gut, his instinct, had kept him alive for 10 years. It was the only thing he trusted. And right now his gut was telling him something was wrong. It wasn't a tangible thing, just a subtle disturbance in the pattern of the afternoon. A car he didn't recognize. A late-model sedan, a deep charcoal gray that looked almost black in the harsh sunlight. It was parked perfectly between the lines, but its presence felt alien. It was too clean, too pristine for this environment. It gleamed with a fresh coat of wax, a stark contrast to the dust-covered employee vehicles scattered across the vast lot. It looked expensive. It looked out of place. Miller's eyes narrowed. He prided himself on knowing the rhythm of his patrol zone, and this car was a dissonant note in an otherwise predictable symphony of civic boredom. He watched it for a full 5 minutes, the cruiser's engine a low thrum beneath him. Nothing, no movement, just the silent, polished machine baking in the sun. It could be a contractor, a visitor for a meeting, but the instinct, that familiar tightening in his chest, told him otherwise. People who belonged here drove practical, forgettable cars. This car had an arrogance to it. He shifted in his seat, the leather creaking in protest. His hand drifted down, resting on the hard plastic grip of his firearm. It was a reflexive gesture, a habit born of 1,000 similar moments where a flicker of suspicion demanded a readiness for violence. He wouldn't draw his weapon, not yet, but the contact was reassuring. It was a solid, undeniable truth in a world he increasingly saw as deceptive. The complaints about his methods, the whispers in the precinct about his aggressive posture, they all missed the point. The world was an aggressive place. You met force with superior force. You met suspicion with overwhelming scrutiny. That's how you stayed ahead. That's how you stayed alive. He watched the gray sedan, his focus absolute. His mind began constructing a narrative, a series of possibilities that all led to the same conclusion. The person associated with this car was not supposed to be here. The car was a cover, a disguise. It was a Trojan horse in the heart of his territory, and it was his job to tear it open and expose what was inside. The stillness of the afternoon no longer felt peaceful. It felt charged, a loaded silence waiting for a trigger. And as the driver's side door of the sedan finally began to open, Officer Miller knew, with a chilling sense of certainty, that he was about to be that trigger. The door of the gray sedan opened with a quiet, solid thud, a sound of precision engineering that seemed to cut through the heavy air. The man who emerged did so not with a rush, but with a fluid, deliberate grace that instantly drew Officer Miller's undivided attention. He was a black man, tall and broad-shouldered, with skin the color of rich, dark coffee. His movements were economical and self-assured as he swung his legs out and stood to his full height. He couldn't be a day over 40. He wore a perfectly pressed white shirt, the collar crisp and sharp. Over it, a deep navy blue suit jacket, tailored to fit his athletic frame flawlessly. A simple, elegant gray tie was knotted perfectly at his throat. His hair was cut in a short, immaculate fade, and his face was clean-shaven, his jawline sharp and defined. He carried a slim leather briefcase in one hand. Every detail, from the polished shine on his black leather shoes to the confident set of his shoulders, screamed professionalism. To an objective observer, he was the very picture of a successful executive, a lawyer, or a high-level consultant, someone who belonged in the corridors of power that this federal building represented. But Officer Miller was not an objective observer. His mind, already primed by suspicion, did not register professionalism. It registered an anomaly, a threat. In his world, a black man who looked like this, driving a car like that in this specific location, was a walking contradiction. The image didn't compute with the crude stereotypes cataloged in his mind. The man's composure felt like a performance, his expensive suit a costume. Miller's internal narrative, which had begun with the car, now shifted to its owner. The man wasn't just out of place, he was a deliberate deception. He was hiding something. Miller's grip on his sidearm tightened. The man, seemingly oblivious to the scrutiny, closed his car door, locked it with a soft electronic chirp, and began walking toward the main entrance of the building. His stride was steady and purposeful, his gaze directed forward. He moved like a man with a destination, a man who knew exactly where he was going and why. This calm, this absolute lack of hesitation was, to Miller, the most suspicious thing of all. A guilty man would be furtive. He would look over his shoulder. He would betray his anxiety with small, nervous gestures. This man's unnerving self-possession felt like the ultimate act of defiance. It was a challenge. Miller threw his cruiser into drive, the tires crunching on the loose gravel of the lot's shoulder as he cut across the empty rows to intercept him. He didn't activate his lights or siren. He wanted the element of surprise, the psychological advantage of a sudden, unsignaled confrontation. He pulled the vehicle to a sharp halt at an angle that blocked the man's path, the front bumper a mere 10 feet from him. The click of the body camera activating was a small, sharp sound in the sudden silence as he killed the engine. He swung his door open and stepped out into the furnace of the afternoon, his shadow falling long and dark across the pavement. He placed his right hand deliberately on the butt of his holstered Glock, a gesture that was both a threat and a comfort. The air was thick with the smell of hot asphalt and Miller's own rising adrenaline. The quiet parking lot had transformed into an arena, and the performance was about to begin. The man stopped, his back still to Miller, his posture unchanged. He didn't flinch. He didn't startle. He simply stood there, a silent, composed figure against the blinding glare of the sun on the building's glass facade, waiting. And that infuriated Miller more than anything else. "Sir, hold it right there!" Miller's voice was sharp, cutting through the thick, humid air with an authority he felt was his birthright. He didn't ask, he commanded. The man in the suit stopped his forward motion, but he didn't turn immediately. For a moment that stretched into an uncomfortable eternity for Miller, he remained facing the building, a silent silhouette. Then, slowly, he turned. His movements were measured, devoid of any suddenness that could be misinterpreted as a threat. He faced the officer, his expression unreadable. It wasn't hostile, nor was it fearful. It was a look of calm, neutral assessment. He took in Miller's tense stance, the hand resting on the holstered weapon, the aggressive angle of the patrol car. "Good afternoon, officer. Is there a problem?" His voice was a deep, even baritone, as smooth and controlled as his appearance. There was no tremor of anxiety, no hint of deference. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being in charge, asking a simple, direct question. The man's composure grated on Miller's already raw nerves. He wanted fear. He expected it. Fear was a confirmation of guilt, a validation of his instincts. The absence of it felt like insolence. "I'll be the one asking the questions," Miller snapped, taking a step closer, invading the man's personal space. "What are you doing here? This is a federal complex." "I'm aware," the man said, his gaze unwavering. "I have a meeting inside." "A meeting," Miller repeated, his tone thick with disbelief. He let the word hang in the air, freighted with insinuation. "A meeting about what? Who are you?" He gestured impatiently with his free hand. "Let me see some identification." The man gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Of course." Again, the movement was slow, telegraphed. He carefully placed his leather briefcase on the scorching pavement beside him. He reached not for his back pocket, where a wallet might be, but into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. Miller's entire body tensed. The inside of a jacket was a danger zone. It was where a weapon could be concealed. His fingers tightened on his firearm, his thumb flicking off the safety strap. He was ready to draw, ready to escalate. But the man's hand emerged holding not a weapon, but a sleek black leather wallet. He opened it methodically. Instead of pulling out a driver's license, his fingers went to a specific slot, retrieving a single laminated card. He held it out for Miller to see. The sunlight, so blinding just moments before, now served to illuminate the card with perfect clarity. It caught the holographic seal, making it flash with iridescent colors. The bold, unmistakable letters at the top seemed to burn into the air itself. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Below them, a photograph of the man, Special Agent Elias Vance, and his credentials. The sight of it should have been a splash of cold water, a sudden shocking dose of reality that instantly de-escalated the entire encounter. This was the proof. This was the undeniable, verifiable truth that dismantled every one of Miller's assumptions. The man wasn't a threat. He wasn't a criminal in a costume. He was not just authorized to be here, he was part of the very fabric of federal law enforcement that this building represented. The air seemed to crackle and go still. The confrontation had reached its defining moment. Miller's instinct had collided head-on with irrefutable fact. One had to yield. But as Officer Miller stared at the ID, at the calm, professional face of Special Agent Vance, he felt not a sense of relief or a recognition of his error, but a hot, surging wave of humiliation and rage. His instinct couldn't be wrong. It had never been wrong. Therefore, the ID had to be the lie. A harsh, ugly sound escaped Officer Miller's lips. It was a snort, a guttural burst of derision that was loud and sharp in the oppressive quiet. "FBI?" he sneered, the word dripping with contempt. "You expect me to believe that? I've seen better fakes come out of a cereal box." He didn't take the ID. He didn't even lean in for a closer look. He simply dismissed it, waved it away with a flick of his wrist as if it were a pesky insect. The decision was made in a split second, a conscious, deliberate rejection of the truth presented to him. His ego, already bruised by the agent's unflappable composure, could not withstand the monumental blow of being so catastrophically wrong. Admitting his mistake now would be an admission of failure, an admission that his vaunted instinct was nothing more than raw, undisciplined prejudice. And Dean Miller would rather escalate a situation to the point of disaster than admit he was wrong. Special Agent Vance did not react to the insult. His hand remained steady, the ID held firmly between his fingers. His expression remained placid, but a new intensity entered his eyes, a flicker of something cold and hard as steel. "Officer," he said, his voice dropping a register, losing its conversational tone and taking on the clipped precision of command. "That is a legitimate United States government credential. I suggest you look at it closely. You can run my name and badge number. It will check out." He was offering Miller a way out, a final chance to step back from the precipice. It was a professional courtesy, a lifeline thrown from one law enforcement officer to another. But Miller didn't see a lifeline. He saw a challenge. He saw a black man in a fancy suit telling him how to do his job, condescending to him in his own territory. The internal monologue that had been simmering now boiled over. Who does this guy think he is? He thinks he can just flash some fake piece of plastic and I'll back down. He thinks he's better than me? The narrative in his head was so powerful, so deeply ingrained, that it overrode all rational thought. Every piece of evidence that contradicted his bias was reinterpreted as further proof of deception. The expensive suit, the calm demeanor, the perfect credentials, it was all part of an elaborate con. He was being tested, and backing down now would be a sign of weakness. "I'm not suggesting anything," Miller growled, taking another aggressive step forward, closing the remaining distance between them. He was close enough now to see the fine weave of the agent's suit, the faint, clean scent of his cologne. "I'm telling you to put your hands where I can see them, now!" The demand was absurd. Vance's hands were already in plain sight, one holding the wallet and ID, the other hanging loosely at his side. It was a power play, a verbal shove designed to provoke a reaction. Vance's gaze held Miller's. He didn't raise his hands. He simply lowered the arm holding the ID, but he did not put it away. "Officer, you are making a serious mistake," he stated, not as a plea, but as a statement of fact. The quiet authority in his voice was absolute. He had seen men like Miller before, insecure, volatile, men who used their badge as a shield for their own inadequacies. He knew that this situation was no longer about a misunderstanding. It was about one man's desperate, dangerous need to be in control. The body camera on Miller's chest was capturing it all. The glint of the legitimate ID, the officer's escalating irrational hostility, the agent's steadfast refusal to be intimidated. The sun beat down, and in the space between the two men, a chasm was opening up, a void between procedure and prejudice, between duty and dereliction, and Miller was about to leap headfirst into it. "A mistake?" Officer Miller let out a short, incredulous laugh. "The only mistake here is you, pal, thinking you could pull this off." He finally looked away from Agent Vance, but only to reach for the radio clipped to his shoulder. His movements were jerky, overly aggressive. He was performing now, not just for Vance, but for the unseen audience he imagined would listen to the recording, for the backup officers who would soon be arriving. He needed to build a record that would justify his actions. He needed to paint a picture of a dangerous, uncooperative suspect. He keyed the microphone, his thumb pressing down hard. "Dispatch, this is 3 Adam 12, he said, his voice strained, artificially high with manufactured urgency. "I'm at the Federal Building East parking lot. I have a suspicious individual refusing to comply." He paused for effect, letting the words sink in. "Black male, approximately 6'2", wearing a suit. He's presenting what I believe to be a fraudulent federal ID, claiming to be FBI." Every word was chosen with deliberate care. Suspicious individual. That established a baseline of threat. Refusing to comply, a blatant lie, as Vance had been nothing but cooperative, yet a crucial phrase for justifying use of force. Fraudulent federal ID. This was the cornerstone of his entire fabrication, the claim that would, he hoped, shield him from the consequences of his own prejudice. Agent Vance stood perfectly still, listening to the transmission. His face was a mask of stoic professionalism, but a muscle feathered in his jaw. He was witnessing a textbook case of an officer creating a false narrative in real time. He knew that every word Miller spoke into that radio was digging the officer's own grave deeper. Vance could have interrupted, could have shouted his credentials for the dispatcher to hear, but he knew it would be pointless. Miller was too far gone, lost in his own fiction. Escalating verbally would only give Miller the reaction he craved. And so, Vance remained silent, a pillar of calm in the face of escalating chaos, letting the officer's own words, captured forever on his body cam, become the primary evidence against him. "Subject is becoming agitated," Miller added, another lie piled upon the first. He glanced at Vance, a wild, almost pleading look in his eyes, as if daring him to protest, to give him some justification for the claim. Vance met his gaze and gave him nothing. Requesting backup, possible impersonation of a federal officer. Impersonating a federal officer was a serious felony. By invoking it, Miller was raising the stakes exponentially. He was no longer conducting a simple field interview. He was now, in his own declared reality, confronting a dangerous felon. He was locking himself into a course of action from which there would be no easy retreat. The dispatcher's voice crackled back, calm and routine, a stark contrast to Miller's frantic energy. 1043 Adam 12, backup is en route, ETA 5 minutes. 5 minutes. It felt like a lifetime. The radio fell silent, and the oppressive heat and quiet of the parking lot rushed back in to fill the void. Miller clipped the radio back to his shoulder, his chest puffed out, emboldened by the promise of reinforcement. He had made his call. He had drawn his line in the sand. Now he just had to hold his ground until his fellow officers arrived to validate his judgment. He turned his full attention back to Vance, a triumphant smirk playing on his lips. "You hear that? My partners are on their way. Now, for the last time, put your hands on your head." The standoff had entered a new, more perilous phase. Miller had burned his bridges to reason and was now waiting for the cavalry to ride in and save him from the consequences of his own lies. The 5 minutes that followed the radio call were a masterclass in psychological warfare, waged in near total silence. The world seemed to shrink to the small patch of asphalt between the two men. The distant hum of traffic on the highway was a muted drone, irrelevant to the charged bubble of tension that had formed in the parking lot. Officer Miller felt a surge of adrenaline-fueled confidence. The call was made. His story was on the record. He had backup coming. He was in control, or so he told himself. He adopted a classic interrogation stance, feet braced apart, body angled slightly, his hand never straying far from his weapon. He was the very picture of a cop in a dangerous situation. But the silence began to work against him. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket woven with the threads of his own lies. He had claimed the suspect was agitated and refusing to comply. Yet Special Agent Elias Vance did neither. He did not put his hands on his head as commanded, but he also made no move to flee or fight. He simply stood there, his posture relaxed but erect. He had tucked his credentials back into his wallet and his wallet back into his jacket pocket in a smooth, unhurried motion. Now his hands hung loosely at his sides, in plain view. He was a statue of composure, his very stillness a refutation of Miller's report. His breathing was slow and even, audible in the quiet. In, out. A steady, rhythmic sound that seemed to mock the frantic pounding of Miller's own heart. Miller found he couldn't stand the quiet. He needed to fill it, to reassert his dominance. "You're in a whole world of trouble, you know that," he said, his voice a low growl. "Impersonating a federal officer carries some serious time. You should have just walked away." He was goading him, trying to elicit any response that could be interpreted as aggression. A word, a flinch, anything. Vance's eyes met his. "The only person in trouble here, officer, is you." He said it without malice, without anger. He said it like a doctor delivering a diagnosis. It was a calm, objective statement of fact, and it struck Miller with more force than any shouted threat could have. The certainty in the agent's voice was unnerving. It planted a seed of doubt, a tiny, cold sliver of fear that began to worm its way through his bravado. What if he's telling the truth? What if that ID was real? The thought was a flash of lightning in the storm of his rage, illuminating for a terrifying instant the sheer drop at the edge of the cliff he was standing on. He pushed the thought away violently. It was a trick, a psychological game. This guy was a pro, a con man trying to get inside his head. "Yeah, right," Miller scoffed, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. He began to pace, a short, tight three-step pattern. The movement was a physical manifestation of his internal turmoil. He was a caged animal, trapped by a confrontation he had initiated and now could not escape. The body camera on his chest captured it all, his nervous energy, his furtive glances around the empty parking lot, the beads of sweat that were now trickling down his temples, tracing paths through the grime of the day. And, in stark, damning contrast, it captured Agent Vance, unmoving, his gaze steady, his presence an unshakable testament to the truth. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of Vance's calm breathing and the crunch of Miller's boots on the sun-baked asphalt. The sound of a man pacing his way toward the end of his career. The distant wail of a siren, growing steadily louder, was a welcome sound to Officer Miller. It was the sound of validation, the sound of backup. Finally, this silent, infuriating standoff would be over. A second patrol car, identical to his own, sped into the parking lot and skidded to a halt about 20 feet away, kicking up a cloud of dust. The doors flew open and two officers emerged. The first was a young patrolman, barely out of his probationary period, his eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The second was Sergeant Frank Reyes, a 20-year veteran with salt and pepper hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from tired granite. Reyes's movements were different from his partner's. He didn't rush out with his hand on his gun. He emerged slowly, his eyes scanning the entire scene with a practiced, analytical gaze. He took in Miller's tense, aggressive posture. He took in the expensive sedan parked neatly in its space. And most importantly, he took in the tall, impeccably dressed black man who stood with an air of preternatural calm, his hands visibly empty at his sides. Reyes had been a cop for a long time. He had seen hundreds of confrontations, and his gut, a far more finely tuned instrument than Miller's, told him immediately and unequivocally that this scene was wrong. The pieces didn't fit. The man in the suit did not look like a suspect. He looked like the calm center of a storm that Miller was single-handedly creating around him. "What's the situation, Dean?" Reyes asked, his voice low and steady as he and the younger officer approached. He kept his distance, creating a buffer, instinctively trying to de-escalate a situation he didn't yet understand. "Sarge, glad you're here," Miller said a little too loudly. Relief and bravado warred in his tone. "This guy here is impersonating a Fed, flashed a bogus FBI ID at me, refused to comply with any of my commands." He gestured with his chin toward Vance. "I was just about to place him under arrest." Reyes's eyes shifted to Vance. He didn't address Miller's accusations directly. Instead, he spoke to the man in the suit, his tone respectful, professional. "Sir, I'm Sergeant Reyes. Can you tell me what's going on here?" It was a simple question, but it was a profound shift in the dynamic. Reyes was not treating Vance as a suspect. He was treating him as a party in a dispute, affording him the courtesy of speaking for himself. Before Vance could answer, Miller interjected, his voice sharp with indignation. "I already told you what's going on, Sarge. He's the perp." Reyes shot Miller a silencing look, a brief, sharp glance that carried the weight of his rank and experience. He then turned his attention back to Vance. Vance met the sergeant's gaze. He saw in Reyes's eyes what had been absent in Miller's: caution, experience, and a willingness to see beyond a preconceived narrative. "Sergeant," Vance said, his voice calm and clear, "my name is Special Agent Elias Vance, Federal Bureau of Investigation. I was on my way into the building for a meeting when your officer here stopped me and accused me of being a suspicious person." He paused, letting the simple, unadorned facts settle in the hot air. "I presented him with my credentials. He refused to examine them, declared them fake, and has been detaining me against my will for the last 10 minutes. The contrast between Miller's frantic accusatory report and Vance's measured factual statement was stark. The younger officer looked back and forth between Miller and Reyes, his confusion palpable. But Sergeant Reyes's expression hardened. He had seen enough. The profound miscalculation Miller had made was now laid bare, and Reyes knew this was no longer a simple field stop. It was a full-blown crisis, and they were all standing at ground zero. Sergeant Reyes felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He had seen officers make mistakes, bad calls, procedural errors, moments of poor judgment. But this felt different. This felt like a willful, ego-driven blunder of catastrophic proportions. The man in front of him carried himself with an unmistakable air of authority. It wasn't just the suit or the calm demeanor, it was in his eyes, in the precise, unwavering way he spoke. This was not a man who impersonated cops. This was a man who trained them. "Dean," Reyes said, turning to Miller, his voice dangerously quiet. "Did you run the ID?" "It's a fake, Sarge. I don't need to run it, I can tell," Miller insisted, his voice cracking with a defensive edge. He could feel the ground shifting beneath him. He had expected his backup to fall in line, to unquestioningly accept his version of events. Reyes's skepticism was a betrayal. "That's not the procedure, and you know it," Reyes said, his voice hardening. The veneer of collegial respect was gone, replaced by the sharp tone of a superior officer addressing a subordinate's failure. "The first step is to verify. Always. You take the ID, you call it in, you get confirmation. You don't get to make a judgment call based on a feeling." He looked from Miller's flushed, angry face to Vance's stoic one. "Sir," he said, addressing Vance with clear respect, "would you be willing to show me your credentials?" "Of course," Vance replied. He once again reached into his jacket and produced the wallet, holding out the FBI identification. This time, Miller physically stepped in the way, blocking Reyes's view. "Don't bother, Sarge. It's part of his act. I've got this under control." The panic was clear in his voice now. For Reyes to verify the ID would be to expose Miller's lie, to shatter the entire foundation of the confrontation. His authority, which was already fragile, was being openly challenged not by the suspect, but by his own sergeant. It was an intolerable humiliation. He felt cornered, trapped between his lie and the looming truth. And like a cornered animal, he chose to lash out. "I am the primary officer on this scene," Miller shouted, his voice echoing unnaturally in the quiet lot. He pointed a trembling finger at Vance. "This man is a suspect in a felony investigation. You will follow my lead." He was pulling rank he didn't have, trying to steamroll his superior through sheer aggression. The younger officer took an involuntary step back, his eyes wide. He was witnessing a complete breakdown of discipline. Reyes stared at Miller, his expression a mixture of disbelief and disgust. The situation was spiraling out of control, and Miller was the one pouring gasoline on the fire. "Stand down, Officer Miller," Reyes commanded, his voice now like ice. "That's a direct order. You are creating a hostile situation where none exists. Let me see the ID." "No!" The word was practically a scream. Miller's face was contorted in a mask of rage and fear. His hand, which had been hovering near his gun, now moved decisively. But it didn't go for his firearm. It went for the handcuffs dangling from his belt. He had reached the point of no return. Reason had failed him. His superior had failed him. His own fabricated narrative was his only remaining reality. He would make it true by force. He turned his back on his sergeant and lunged toward Special Agent Vance. "You are under arrest for impersonating a federal officer," he yelled, his voice a raw, desperate roar. In that moment, he wasn't a police officer upholding the law. He was a man committing a desperate, career-ending act of self-destruction. The moment Officer Miller declared his intention to arrest, the atmosphere in the parking lot shifted from tense to critical. It was a catastrophic failure of protocol, a complete break from the chain of command, acted out in the blinding afternoon sun. Sergeant Reyes shouted, "Dean, no! Stand down!" But his voice was lost in the hurricane of Miller's singular, ruinous focus. Special Agent Vance saw Miller coming. He had been anticipating this escalation, reading the panic and desperation in the officer's eyes. He didn't recoil. He didn't raise his hands to defend himself. Instead, he stood his ground, his body squaring up slightly, his center of gravity lowering. It was the subtle, ingrained posture of a man trained in close-quarters combat, a man who was prepared for violence but would not initiate it. As Miller reached for him, Vance spoke, his voice not a shout, but a low, penetrating warning that cut through Miller's rage. "Officer Miller, if you touch me, you will be assaulting a federal agent in the commission of his duties. Think very carefully about your next action. The warning was clear, precise, and legally potent. It laid out the exact federal statute Miller was about to violate. It was the final off-ramp on a highway to disaster, a last, desperate appeal to the part of Miller that was still a police officer, the part that understood the law. But Miller was beyond hearing. The words were just noise, interference in the feedback loop of his own fear and fury. His reality had narrowed to a single, obsessive goal. He had to get the cuffs on this man. Cuffs would make him a prisoner. Cuffs would make him wrong. Cuffs would make Miller right. He lunged forward, grabbing Vance's left arm with a clumsy, sweat-slicked hand. He fumbled with the handcuffs, his fingers clumsy and uncoordinated. The fine material of Vance's suit jacket was smooth and unyielding under his grip. For his part, Vance did not resist in the way Miller expected. He didn't pull away or struggle. He allowed the contact but held his ground, turning his body into an immovable object. The sheer, solid strength of the man was startling to Miller. It felt like trying to restrain a pillar of granite. "I am ordering you to stop resisting," Miller grunted. The words a farce, given Vance was doing no such thing. He was trying to create a record for the body camera, a justification for the force he was now using. He managed to get one of the cuffs around Vance's wrist, the cold metal clinking against a high-end watch. From behind him, Miller could hear Sergeant Reyes on his own radio, his voice urgent and sharp. "Dispatch, send a supervisor to this location immediately. Officer is non-compliant." Reyes knew he had lost control of his subordinate. He was now a witness to a crime being committed by another officer, and his priority shifted from de-escalation to documentation and containment. The younger officer stood frozen, a deer in the headlights, utterly unsure of how to intervene in a confrontation between two of his own. The scene was surreal. One officer assaulting a man while his own sergeant called for help to stop him. The chain of command hadn't just been broken, it had been inverted and set on fire. And as Miller struggled to secure the second cuff, grunting with exertion under the hot sun, he had no idea that he wasn't just arresting a man, he was ending his own life as he knew it. The metallic click of the first handcuff locking around Special Agent Vance's wrist was a shockingly loud sound. It was a sound of finality, the closing of a door that could never be reopened. Officer Miller, breathing heavily, struggled to bring Vance's other arm behind his back. The agent remained passive, offering no assistance but no active resistance either. His stillness was its own form of defiance, a silent protest against the absurdity of the situation. He let Miller manipulate his arms, his movements economical, preserving his energy, his dignity intact even in this degrading position. The body camera, strapped to Miller's chest, provided a visceral, first-person view of the assault. It captured the tremor in Miller's own hands as he fumbled with the second cuff. It recorded his ragged, shallow breaths, a stark audio contrast to the steady, calm breathing of the man he was arresting. The lens was so close it could pick up the fine details. The sheen of sweat on Miller's knuckles, the taut strain of the fabric on Vance's suit as his arms were forced into an unnatural position. The glint of the sun off the polished steel of the cuffs. It was a damning, intimate portrait of an officer losing control. Finally, with a grunt of exertion, Miller managed to secure the second cuff. Click! Another sound of irrevocable consequence. He had done it. He had subdued the threat, proven his point. He yanked Vance upright, a rough, unprofessional jerk meant to assert dominance. "Now you'll learn to show some respect," he panted, his voice a mixture of triumph and exhaustion. He began to march Vance toward his patrol car. But as they took the first few steps across the scorching asphalt, Vance spoke again. His voice was unchanged. It was still calm, still measured, but now it carried an edge of cold, hard promise. "Officer Miller," he said, not even turning his head, "my hands are now secured. For your own safety and for the sake of any leniency you might hope for, I strongly advise you not to place me in your vehicle." The words stopped Miller in his tracks. They were so bizarre, so completely out of sync with the reality he had created that he couldn't immediately process them. For his own safety? Leniency? This man, his prisoner, was warning him. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. "You're not in a position to be giving me advice," Miller snarled, giving Vance's cuffed arms another shove. "On the contrary," Vance replied, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet lot. "I am in the only position that matters. I am an agent of the federal government, and you have just committed a felony against me on federal property." He paused, then added the final, chilling sentence. "And my backup is already here." Miller frowned, confused. What backup? His backup was here, Reyes and the rookie. He followed Vance's gaze, which was directed past him, toward the main road leading into the office park. At first, there was nothing. Then Miller saw them. Three black SUVs, driving in a tight, disciplined formation, moving much faster than the posted speed limit. They had no lights flashing, no sirens wailing, but they moved with an unmistakable purpose. They weren't patrol cars. They were sleek, silent, and menacing. As they turned into the parking lot, fanning out with practiced, tactical precision, a wave of ice-cold dread washed over Officer Miller, extinguishing the fire of his rage in an instant. The prisoner in his custody hadn't been bluffing, and the game, which Miller thought he had just won, was suddenly, terrifyingly, over. The arrival of the black SUVs was so swift and silent, it felt as though they had materialized out of the heat haze itself. They weren't police vehicles. They were federal. Their tinted windows betrayed no hint of the occupants, but their synchronized, aggressive movement spoke volumes. They fanned out, boxing in the two patrol cars and the small group of people at the center of the drama, their powerful engines rumbling to a stop. For a few seconds, nothing happened. The doors remained closed. The silence that descended was heavier and more menacing than any that had come before. Sergeant Reyes and the young officer stood frozen, their hands raised slightly in a universal gesture of non-threat. They understood immediately that the authority on this scene had just been transferred, absolutely and irrevocably. Officer Miller stood paralyzed, his hand still gripping Vance's arm. The triumphant smirk had vanished from his face, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of pure shock. His mind struggled to catch up with the reality that was unfolding. This couldn't be happening. It was a nightmare. These vehicles, this overwhelming show of force, couldn't be for the man he had in handcuffs. Then, the doors of all three SUVs opened in perfect unison. 6 men emerged, 2 from each vehicle. They were all dressed like Vance, in sharp, functional suits, their faces grim and professional. They moved with a predatory grace, fanning out to secure the perimeter. They weren't cops. They were agents. Their focus was absolute, their every action honed by years of training. One of them, a tall, gray-haired man with the severe face of a hawk, was clearly in command. He strode forward, his eyes locked on the scene, completely ignoring the local police officers. His gaze fell on the handcuffs adorning Agent Vance's wrists, and his expression, already grim, darkened into something thunderous. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes finally landing on Miller. He didn't shout. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't need to. His voice, when he spoke, was low and resonated with a power that made the air vibrate. "I am Special Agent in Charge Connolly," he announced, his eyes boring into Miller's. "You have exactly 5 seconds to release my agent before I have you arrested for kidnapping a federal officer." The word kidnapping hit Miller like a physical blow. It was a legal term so far beyond the scope of his own fabricated charges that it short-circuited his brain. He stared at the agent in charge, then at the man he still held captive. The pieces finally, horrifically clicked into place. The pristine car, the tailored suit, the unnerving calm, the flawless credentials. It was all real, every last bit of it. He had not uncovered a clever impersonator. He had, in a fit of blind, prejudiced rage, assaulted and illegally detained one of the most powerful law enforcement officers in the country. His hand fell away from Vance's arm as if it had been burned. His entire body began to shake, a violent, uncontrollable tremor that started in his hands and spread through his entire frame. The silent, swift arrival of this higher power had done more than just end the standoff. It had completely annihilated Dean Miller's world. Special Agent in Charge Connolly did not wait for the 5 seconds to elapse. He saw the comprehension and terror dawn on Officer Miller's face, and he saw the man's hands drop away from Agent Vance. With a curt nod, 2 of his agents moved forward with brisk efficiency. One of them produced a small, universal handcuff key. "Turn around, officer," the agent said. The word officer was spoken with a heavy, deliberate irony. It was a title, not a sign of respect. Miller was too stunned to comply or resist. He just stood there, shaking, his eyes wide and vacant. Sergeant Reyes, seeing the need for some semblance of order, stepped forward and gently but firmly turned Miller around. "Do as he says, Dean," Reyes murmured, his voice heavy with a mixture of pity and resignation. The federal agent stepped in and, with a few deft movements, unlocked the cuffs from Vance's wrists. The moment he was free, Vance brought his hands in front of him, rubbing his wrists, not out of pain, but as if to wipe away the memory of the cold steel. He gave Connolly a brief, meaningful nod. "Took you long enough, John," he said, a hint of dry humor in his voice that was utterly chilling in its casualness. "We were monitoring the local channel from the moment you were stopped, Elias," Connolly replied, his voice a low rumble of controlled fury. "We had to let him build his own case. Your body cam audio was being fed to us live." He turned his cold gaze back to Miller. And he did not disappoint. The revelation that his every word and action had been monitored live by the FBI caused a visible shudder to run through Miller. The body camera he had activated to create his own narrative had instead been broadcasting his career suicide in real time to the very agency he had foolishly antagonized. Connolly then pointed a commanding finger at Miller. "That man," he said to his agents, his voice leaving no room for argument, "is to be taken into custody. He is to be charged with assault on a federal officer, unlawful detainment, and civil rights violations under color of law." He then turned his attention to Sergeant Reyes and the rookie officer, who had been standing by as horrified witnesses. "You 2 will remain here. We will be taking your statements. Your department's internal affairs and the U.S. Attorney's Office will be contacted within the hour. Do not touch anything. This is now a federal crime scene." 2 more federal agents moved in on Miller. They didn't use the same clumsy force Miller had used on Vance. Their movements were practiced and impersonal. They turned him around and, with a swift, professional motion, pulled his arms behind his back. Miller let out a choked, half-sob, half-gasp as he felt his own department-issue handcuffs being clicked onto his wrists. The metallic sound echoed the one that had sealed his fate just minutes earlier, but this time it was a sound of justice, of a sudden and brutal reversal of fortunes. He was no longer the enforcer, he was the perpetrator. The predator had become the prey. As they began to lead him toward one of the black SUVs, the man he had arrested, Special Agent Elias Vance, walked past him. Vance paused for a brief moment, looked Miller directly in the eye, and said nothing at all. The silence was more damning than any curse, a final, quiet testament to the magnitude of Miller's ruin. The moment the cold steel of his own handcuffs locked around his wrists, something inside Dean Miller shattered. The entire architecture of his identity, the tough, street-smart cop who trusted his gut above all else, crumbled into dust. The bravado, the aggression, the self-righteous certainty all evaporated, leaving behind only a terrified, broken man. His legs felt weak, and if the 2 federal agents hadn't been holding him up, he might have collapsed onto the scorching asphalt. A low, keening sound escaped his throat, a sound of pure, animal despair. The body camera, still recording, now captured his own unraveling. The lens, pointing downward, filmed his shaking hands, cuffed behind his back. It recorded the frantic, terrified pattern of his own breathing. The audio picked up his pathetic, choked sobs. The objective, unblinking eye that he had intended to be the star witness for his prosecution was now the primary narrator of his humiliation. As the agents guided him toward the waiting SUV, he looked wildly around, his eyes begging for help, for an ally, for anyone to tell him this was a mistake. He looked at Sergeant Reyes, but Reyes wouldn't meet his gaze, his face a grim mask of professional duty. He looked at the rookie, who quickly looked down at his own boots, wanting no part of this catastrophic fallout. There was no help for him here. He was utterly, completely alone. "This is a mistake, a misunderstanding," Miller stammered, the words tumbling out slurred and indistinct. I thought he looked suspicious." The excuses sounded feeble and pathetic even to his own ears. They were the hollow echoes of a prejudice that had now cost him everything. Agent in charge Connolly, who was overseeing the process with grim satisfaction, heard him. He walked over, stopping directly in front of Miller. He leaned in close, his voice a venomous whisper. "He looked suspicious? Or he looked like a black man in a car that you thought he had no business driving? You didn't think anything, officer. You reacted. You reacted out of a bigotry so profound you were willing to throw away your entire career for it. You saw a man who didn't fit into your tiny, pathetic worldview, and you decided to make him pay for it. Well, now it's your turn to pay." Connolly's words were like surgical strikes, each one severing a tendon of Miller's last remaining defenses. They pushed Miller toward the open rear door of the SUV. He stumbled, his legs clumsy and uncooperative. As they bundled him into the back seat, the sterile, air-conditioned chill of the vehicle was a shocking contrast to the oppressive heat outside. The door slammed shut with a heavy, final thud, sealing him in. Through the tinted window, he could see the scene he had created. Federal agents moving with calm purpose, Sergeant Reyes talking grimly into his radio, and Special Agent Elias Vance, standing tall and composed, his suit barely rumpled, already giving his preliminary statement to another agent. He looked exactly as he had when he first stepped out of his car, powerful, professional, and completely in control. Miller pressed his face against the cool glass, the reality of his situation finally crashing down on him with the force of a physical impact. He had picked a fight with a giant, armed with nothing but his own ignorance. The unraveling was complete. He was no longer Officer Dean Miller. He was a federal prisoner, a cautionary tale, a man whose life was now defined by the single worst decision he had ever made. With Dean Miller secured in the back of the SUV, a chillingly efficient federal apparatus swung into motion. The parking lot was no longer just a parking lot. It was, as Agent in Charge Connolly had declared, a federal crime scene. While two agents stood guard by the vehicle containing the now sobbing Miller, the others began their work. One agent started taking a formal recorded statement from Sergeant Reyes, whose voice was low and weary as he recounted the events, from the moment he arrived to his subordinate's complete breakdown of discipline. Another agent spoke with the rookie, whose account was more fragmented, punctuated by phrases like, "I couldn't believe it," and "he just wouldn't listen." Special Agent Elias Vance, meanwhile, gave his own statement to Connolly. His account was delivered with the same dispassionate clarity he had maintained throughout the ordeal. He detailed the initial stop, Miller's immediate hostility, the refusal to inspect his credentials, the fabricated radio report, and the final assault. He spoke not with anger, but with the precise language of a legal report, building a verbal case brick by brick that would soon be translated into an unbreakable written one. The body camera footage from Miller's own vest would serve as the undeniable cornerstone of that case. An agent with a tablet was already coordinating with local police command to ensure the footage was immediately downloaded and secured as federal evidence, preventing any possibility of it being lost or erased. Within 15 minutes, a black sedan from the U.S. Attorney's Office pulled into the lot. A stern-faced woman in a business suit got out, introduced herself as an assistant U.S. attorney, and was immediately briefed by Connolly. She listened intently, her expression growing colder with every detail. She glanced over at the SUV where Miller was being held, then back at Vance. "Agent Vance, are you injured?" she asked, her voice sharp and professional. "No," Vance replied. "Just my dignity." The AUSA gave a grim nod. "We'll take care of that." The cold machinery of federal justice was now fully engaged. Calls were made, jurisdictions were established. Miller's patrol car was photographed and would be impounded as part of the scene. His firearm, his badge, and his ID were confiscated on the spot by Sergeant Reyes, acting under direct orders relayed from his own frantic chief of police, who was already on the phone with Connolly. The official notification of Miller's immediate and indefinite suspension pending termination was delivered verbally by Reyes, who had to open the SUV door to address the shattered man inside. Miller didn't even seem to register the words, his face buried in his hands. His career hadn't just ended, it had been publicly and humiliatingly executed in the space of less than an hour, in the same parking lot where he had felt so powerful just a short time before. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the asphalt, the federal agents began to wrap up their on-site work. The SUVs started their engines, their low rumble a death knell for Dean Miller's future. His life was now a piece of federal paperwork, his fate to be decided in the cold, impersonal halls of a justice system he had sworn to uphold, but had instead disgracefully betrayed. After giving his final on-scene statement, Special Agent Elias Vance retrieved his leather briefcase from the pavement where he had placed it what felt like a lifetime ago. He ran a hand over his suit jacket, smoothing the wrinkles caused by the struggle, a small, unconscious gesture to restore the order that had been so violently disrupted. Agent in charge Connolly walked with him toward the entrance of the federal building. "Are you sure you're all right, Elias?" Connolly asked, his voice softer now that they were out of earshot of the others. "That was ugly." "I've been through worse," Vance said, though his voice carried a deep weariness. "But it's been a while since it's been this blatant." He paused at the glass doors, looking back at the scene. The last of the SUVs was pulling away, taking the disgraced Officer Miller with it. Sergeant Reyes and the rookie were left standing by their patrol car, looking small and lost in the vast, empty lot. "The Sergeant Reyes," Vance noted. "He was good, tried to do the right thing." "We'll make a note of that in the report," Connolly affirmed. "It might be the only thing that saves their department from a full-scale federal oversight investigation." They entered the building, the rush of cold air a welcome relief. The marble lobby was quiet, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. As they walked toward the elevators, Vance felt the adrenaline from the encounter finally begin to recede, leaving a familiar, heavy exhaustion in its place. It wasn't the physical toll, it was the mental and emotional weight of the constant vigilance his life required. The burden of knowing that his skin color, in certain eyes, would always supersede his rank, his accomplishments, and even his federal badge. He could be one of the most highly trained law enforcement officers in the nation, but to a man like Dean Miller, he would always be just a suspicious black man first. They rode the elevator up in silence. When they reached the secure floor of the FBI field office, Vance headed straight for his office. It was a standard, functional space, but it was his sanctuary. He sat down heavily in his chair, the leather sighing under his weight. He loosened his tie, the first and only crack in his otherwise perfect composure all day. For a long moment he just sat there, staring at the cityscape through his window. The quiet burden of his professionalism was that he couldn't just go home and forget this. He couldn't just chalk it up to a bad day. He now had a duty to document it. He opened his briefcase, pulled out a laptop, and powered it on. The first document he needed to file was the official report. Assault on a federal officer. Unlawful detainment. He had to recount every detail, every word, every gesture with cold, clinical objectivity. He had to become the dispassionate narrator of his own dehumanization. As he began to type, the words flowing with practiced ease, he felt a grim resolve settle over him. Miller was a symptom of a sickness, and while Vance couldn't cure the disease, he could and would ensure that this particular symptom was excised with surgical precision. The report he was writing would be more than just a document. It would be a weapon, a tool to ensure that what happened to him today would not, if he could help it, happen to someone else tomorrow. It was a heavy burden, but it was his to carry. And as his fingers flew across the keyboard, he carried it with the same quiet, unshakable resolve he had shown in the parking lot below. The downfall of Dean Miller was as swift as it was absolute. His case never went to a jury. Faced with the undeniable, crystal-clear body camera footage, his own camera, and the testimony of 2 fellow officers and a half-dozen FBI agents, he had no defense. His lawyer advised him to take a plea deal. He was convicted on federal charges of depriving a citizen of his civil rights under color of law. The impersonation charge he had tried to pin on Vance was, in a turn of profound irony, the charge that most closely resembled his own actions. He had impersonated a real police officer, acting instead as a vessel for his own raw prejudice. He was sentenced to several years in a federal prison, stripped of his pension, and forbidden from ever carrying a badge again. The civil lawsuit filed by Special Agent Vance, not for personal gain, but on principle, with all damages donated to a police reform charity, resulted in a multi-million-dollar settlement that the city was forced to pay, a stark financial reminder of the cost of unchecked bias in their ranks. The body cam footage, released after the criminal proceedings, became a national phenomenon. It was dissected on news channels, used as a training tool in police academies, and viewed millions of times online. It was a perfect, contained drama that illustrated a complex national issue. Miller became a symbol of racist policing, his snarling face and panicked lies a case study in how quickly authority can curdle into tyranny. Conversely, Elias Vance became a reluctant icon of professionalism and restraint. His calm, his precision, his refusal to be broken or even angered by the venom directed at him was held up as an example for law enforcement and civilians alike. He had won the confrontation not by escalating, but by maintaining a level of control that his assailant could only dream of. He became a quiet testament to the idea that true strength isn't about how loudly you shout, but how steadfastly you stand in the truth. The story echoed through the halls of justice and across the landscape of a nation grappling with its own demons. It was a stark lesson in accountability, a clear demonstration that sometimes, in the blinding light of truth, the system, however flawed, can work. Dean Miller's career was over, his life irrevocably altered, all because of a choice made in a sun-drenched parking lot. A choice to trust his prejudice over his training, his ego over the evidence right before his eyes. In the quiet aftermath, it's worth asking why. Why did Officer Miller self-destruct so spectacularly? His actions weren't born in a vacuum. They were the culmination of 1,000 small resentments, a career of feeling overlooked, and a deep-seated insecurity that manifested as bigotry. He saw in Agent Vance everything he wasn't, successful, respected, and powerful in a way that had nothing to do with a gun and a badge. Vance's very existence was an affront to Miller's worldview, and in that parking lot, Miller tried to violently reshape reality to fit his prejudice. It was an act of profound weakness masquerading as strength. What if Vance had acted differently? What if he had immediately shouted his credentials or reacted with anger to Miller's first insult? It likely would have ended in tragedy. Miller was looking for a justification to escalate, and any aggression from Vance would have been twisted into resisting arrest, giving Miller the excuse he craved to use greater force. Vance's calm, almost detached professionalism was his shield and his sword. He understood that in a battle against irrationality, the only winning move is not to play the game. By refusing to meet Miller's aggression with aggression of his own, he forced the officer's prejudice to stand alone, exposed and ugly in the harsh light of day and the unblinking lens of the camera. The lesson here is a difficult one. It speaks to the immense burden placed on those who are the targets of prejudice. It demands a level of restraint from the victim that we should be demanding as a baseline from those in authority. For all of us, the story is a visceral reminder that prejudice is a poison, not just to society, but to the soul of the person who carries it. It blinds you, it corrodes your judgment, and as Dean Miller learned, it can lead you down a path to utter ruin. What did you feel when you saw Agent Vance maintain his composure in the face of such blatant disrespect? Have you ever witnessed a situation where someone's calm response completely disarmed an aggressor? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you believe that professionalism and accountability are the cornerstones of true justice, make sure to subscribe for more stories like this.